Okay, well, that was a great film to start with. And I almost feel like who needs a speech? Because all the themes that I've got in this speech were kind of summed up in the film that you've just seen. And I think it's obvious to all of us, this is a very important time to have a conference in Yorkshire. Above all, because of what's taking place in Britain, what's happening now in the class struggle and what is going to develop. But of course, as the film indicated, it's also against the background of worldwide developments. And I'm not going to spend long on them today, I haven't got space for that. But just a few sentences, because developments in Britain really are against the background of a world in turmoil. We can all see, can't we? Increasing climate change, the ongoing war in Ukraine, growing global tensions, and the tremors shaking the world financial system. A few classic bank runs we've had in the course of the last few months, and there are going to be more. In the end, what's taken place in the finance markets so far is a reflection of the end of the era of cheap money. And what we mean by that is not cheap money for us, although it's true it was nice when interest rates were lower, but the fact that for decades, the major governments of the world, the major economies, have pumped huge sums of money fundamentally into the stock markets to keep the champagne flowing for the financiers and the super rich. And quantitative easing, ultra-low interest rates, the means by which they've done that, it seemed like they could get away with it scot-free. They could continue forever, effectively turning on the printing presses to fuel the gambling of the super rich. But no more. The interest rates of the last 2 years, the inflation of the last 2 years, the interest rates rises, has already created shocks in the financial system. It will create more over time, and it reflects the fact that that era of cheap money, seemingly without cost, has gone forever. Fundamentally, it flows from a specific set of historical circumstances. The era after the Soviet Union and the regimes that existed in Eastern Europe collapsed, and the US was the one world hyperpower, able to tell the rest of the world what to do completely, and at the same time there was more than 1 billion workers from China, the ex-Soviet Union and so on, who entered the world market, and the capitalists were able to use that to drive down our share of the wealth, to drive down wages, and to produce goods cheaply in China in particular. And that era allowed them to get away with all the cheap money. But clearly, that era's gone. It's not there anymore. The US is still the most powerful capitalist country on the planet, but it's no longer able to call the shots. It's declining. The fact that Russia felt confident to invade the Ukraine is a reflection of that. And obviously, China is no longer content to be an assembly plant for Western capitalist powers, but is competing with them, and therefore we're living in this multipolar, chaotic world for capitalism, and therefore for all of us. And within that, Britain, of course, is a third-rate power. So you've got this increased competition between the big powers, but Britain is not in the top tier of capitalist powers. The economy is still 0.5% smaller than the pre-pandemic level. That is not true for the other major capitalist powers. It's true, in the last quarter, we escaped recession. Woo! The economy grew by a magnificent 0.1% in the first quarter of this year. So, you know, it's not actually in recession, but it's doing pretty badly. Historically, I suppose you could say that the progressive character, capitalism was always a brutal, exploitative system. But you could say that it played a progressive role historically in the sense that it developed science and technique. Fundamentally, it increased the productivity of labour. And that has been the kind of historical driving force for capitalism. Globally now, for all the AI and the talk about new technology and so on, productivity is increasing at a very low level globally, and in Britain, investment levels are incredibly low, and productivity is not increasing at all. It's the lowest level in 250 years. So basically, for more or less the whole history of capitalism, it is the lowest level of increases in productivity. It could not be clearer that capitalism globally as a system does not work, is increasingly in crisis, and in Britain, as a weak capitalist power, is amongst the most vulnerable of the major economies to every crisis that comes along. Inflation in Britain, as we know, has dropped marginally, but it's still at extremely high levels, much higher than they expected. Last week in Britain, there was turmoil. It didn't get reported that much in the media, but there was turmoil in the markets. The price of government bonds, which are called gilts in Britain, tumbled almost as low as they did when trusts tanked the markets. Didn't get reported in the same way. But that was because inflation was still much higher than the markets were expecting, and they responded to that. It resulted in swathes of mortgages being withdrawn from the markets, with all the difficulties of that means for people who are trying to get onto the housing ladder. But let's be clear, for those who've managed to get mortgages, overwhelmingly older workers, very few young people in that situation, 2/3 of the hike in mortgage costs as a result of the interest rate rises that have already happened have not yet fed through. In other words, the majority of the pain is still to come in terms of the consequences of the rising interest rates for the mortgage markets. And even now, I won't give loads of statistics because you all know this, but there are already 11 million people who are having difficulty paying their bills. 1 in 7 adults in Britain missing meals because they cannot afford to eat every 3 meals a day. And it's true that they're saying, well, don't worry, CPI inflation, which is not the most accurate measure of inflation, but that will come down to 5% by the end of the year. It is going to get better, etc., etc. But the reality is the capitalist class don't know. They have no idea what interest rates are going to be at or what is going to happen with inflation. Even if there is no more major market turmoil, and that is a very big if, given the circumstances, they don't know how far they will succeed in squeezing inflation out of the system. But the degree to which they succeed will be as a result of inflicting misery on us, the economy going to recession, jobs starting to go. In other words, we're going to suffer whichever way they get out of this. But a lesson should be learned by the trade union leaders, even some of the more left-wing trade union leaders. I vividly remember a few months ago waking up to hear Matt Rack, the leader of the Fire Brigades Union, saying on my radio, we think that we can accept this deal, which is 5% for what is now the current year, then it was the year to come, because the economists have guaranteed inflation is going to come down to 5%. And I think, Matt, don't be daft. Don't trust capitalist economists. Instead, take the approach that we do. Call their bluff. Demand that pay rises are linked to inflation, are guaranteed against increases in inflation. Tell the fire bosses, we're happy to accept 5% if inflation has come down, but inflation is still 10%, we want 10%. If you're so confident, why aren't you prepared to proof pay rises against inflation? Now, I'm not going to spend more time on the economy in this short introduction, but I've begun on it because it's the background to everything else that we're discussing today. All the factors which mean we have now entered a new period of class struggle in Britain, with bigger opportunities for socialists for ourselves. The economy lies at the root of them. The economy lies at the root of why the Tories are ripping lumps out of each other again. It lies at the root of why the strikes are so persistent and are continuing despite all the press reports that the strike wave is over. And it also lies at the root of what is going to be quite a shallow and short-lived period of hopes in the next Labour government. Because let's be clear, people will hope against hope. They'll be desperate to get rid of the Tories, and Labour getting in, people will say, oh, it's got to be better, give them a chance, go on, just let's see. But the reality is, when New Labour Mark 1 was elected, the economy was growing by 4.9%. So for all the misery that New Labour inflicted, they did throw a few crumbs to the working class. But that that was in a period where they could do it without upsetting the boardrooms. It's going to be very different this time around, and that is what will undermine an incoming Labour government quite quickly. Now, of course, I am certain that there are comrades in this room, maybe a majority of the comrades in this room, who are thinking, you're talking about Starmer as the next Prime Minister, but he's going to mess it up. He's so right-wing. He's so wooden and useless. He's not going to manage to win the general election. And look, nothing is ever 100% certain for future elections. You have to wait and see what happens on the day. But in our view, actually, the local elections did show that it is overwhelmingly likely that Starmer is heading for number 10. Not because Labour did well in those local elections. They did not do well in those local elections. Their share of the vote was actually static at 35%. The reason is because it showed the deep hatred now of the Tory party. The fact that they went down to 26% of the vote, and let's be clear, the last time those seats were up was in 2019, when Theresa May was on her way out of the door, and they lost 1,300 seats then. To lose another 1,000 on top, to tell your spin doctors to say you're going to lose 1,000 seats, confident it will then look good, and then actually to lose slightly more than 1,000 seats, that really shows that the government is in trouble. Now, people might say, well, maybe they can turn it round before the general election. After all, Boris Johnson managed to get 43% of the vote in 2019. Couldn't they somehow pull off the same trick again? But in our view, there is no prospect of that. That was very specific circumstances. The mistakes that Corbyn had made on Brexit allowed Johnson to use the mantra of getting Brexit done to appeal to get the votes of a section of the working class, but more generally, fundamentally, the whole of the capitalist class, the elites, united behind Boris Johnson because they did not want Corbyn in number 10. And therefore, they were prepared to shut up about everything they thought about Boris Johnson in order to get that result in the general election. We're now in a totally different situation. The Tory party are busy ripping lumps out of each other. The bloodbath taking place now is preparation for the splits that are going to take place, probably after the next general election, but you wouldn't rule them out even developing before the general election. The fact that Johnson is cynically handing over his WhatsApp messages in order to expose Sunak, because of course Sunak doesn't want his WhatsApp messages handed in, and everything he said on Eat Out to Help Out and who knows what else he's got in those messages, they're prepared to just hang each other out to dry with no interest in trying to defend their party. The fact that the right populist wing of the Tory party, which is the majority of the Tory party these days, in reality, are openly blaming the capitalist state, the blob as they call it, for being out to get them, says everything. First of all, it says how they have no interest in what the Tory party did historically, which is defending the long-term interests of capitalism. Because that capitalist state is who would have been intervening if Jeremy Corbyn had won a general election. So, oh, don't do anything too radical, you can't do this, you can't do that, and yet they're prepared to attack them, to take them to court and so on, to blatantly undermine them. But of course, it also shows that the blob is out to get them. They're not wrong. They do want them out of office because they have a much more reliable alternative for the interests of the capitalist class in Starmer's Labour. The big majority of the capitalist class in Britain would rather have them in power because they will do the job more efficiently than this Tory party is able to do. Of course, in the wake of the local election debacle, Sunak's response was to say, I'm going to keep turning around the economy, I'm going to keep saving the NHS, and I'm going to keep turning away those small boats, and that way I'll win the general election. He doesn't believe it. Nobody believes it. He stands no chance on the economy. Clearly, there is no possibility of him changing the accurate perception of the majority in this country now that the NHS is falling apart. What he has been able to do is to whip up racism with the disgusting campaign on the issue of the small boats, which is not, it's got nothing to do with levels of immigration or any effective policy on immigration at all. They've had a brutal anti-migrant policy before this legislation, and they've still got one after it. It's about whipping up racism and trying to win a few votes with these brutal, horrific policies. But let's be clear, it is succeeding in whipping up racism with a layer, and the workers' movement has a vital role to play in fighting against that. But it's not winning support for the Tories. It's not getting them any extra votes. In fact, disgustingly, Starmer's policy is not fundamentally different to Sunak's on this issue. He takes an equally anti-migrant, anti-refugee position, but he's now more trusted on migration than the Tory party, which is an indication that no matter what this government does, and no matter how disgustingly they behave, it is not going to win them the next election. And of course, while they are succeeding in whipping up racism amongst a layer, the class issues, the cost of living crisis, the NHS are much more to the fore amongst almost every section of the working class than the question of racism at this point in time. Generally, though, I think what we're seeing in elections is a return to the pre-Corbyn era. What we mean by that is if you go back to the 1950s, most people voted, turnouts in elections were 80-odd%, and literally 97% of people, or something like that, voted Labour or Tory. So there were clear blocks, working class Labour voters and generally better off Tory voters. That trend has been undermined over a whole period, so that in 2010 it was very low turnouts, but only 65% of voters voted Labour or Tory. Because there are no longer the same fundamental differences. Labour is a big business party as well. And those deep loyalties have broken down. That was temporarily cut across in the Corbyn era. In 2017, 82% of people voted for the main parties. And that was people being mobilised enthusiastically for Corbyn's programme, but it was also the forces of reaction being mobilised against Corbyn's programme and voted for the Tory party. Now we're back to a fragmentation of politics, a growing instability, people looking for means to protest. In the last elections, there was a whole layer who voted to the left as they saw it by voting Green, seeing the Greens as being a bit more left-wing than the main parties, although I have to say, if you look at the role that the leadership of the Green Party played in the Corbyn era, they showed that they're not left in reality. But you can also see a vote for right populist parties and so on growing, particularly beyond the next general election. Nonetheless, while actually, in my view, Starmer would prefer a minority government. He would prefer to be in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats beyond the general election, because that would give him an excuse for carrying out his terrible policies, for doing nothing in the interests of the working class. And that's a possible outcome. In my personal view, it's probably still more likely that he will get a majority, potentially on quite a low turnout and with no enthusiasm whatsoever, but people will go and vote because they want to get rid of the Tories. They're desperate to get rid of the Tories, and they will vote for the party that thinks they can, that will do that. I think it's clear in terms of our preparation that Sunak intends to go for the general election either on the same day as the locals next year or after that, later next year. But Tory plans don't always work out at the moment. And so we have to be prepared that they're forced into calling a general election earlier than that. There's no guarantee that that is when it will take place, because of course this is, as I think is clear to all of us, an extremely weak government, and it is facing continued opposition from a workers' movement that has learned an enormous amount in the course of the last year. We have gone from the lowest level of recorded strikes in history back in 2017 to the highest level in 30 years. The working class really is back. Now, of course, as we've said, inevitably, at the start of the strikes, most of the workers taking part in strike action were quite naive, because they'd never been on strike before. How could they have been? There haven't been many strikes to take part in. And lots of things, the idea of all-out strike action, as opposed to just coming out for a few days. The idea that a picket line is a thing you have to have, and it's there designed to stop workers going into the workplace and breaking the strike. Those ideas had really gone right back and have been gradually rebuilt in the course of the strike movement. But nonetheless, undoubtedly, we're still at the early stages of a rebuilding of the movement.
Nonetheless, the most important conclusion for us to draw is not that real point that we're still at the beginning, workers are still in the process of learning lessons, but that despite that, they have shown incredible courage and determination, and at every stage have pushed their leaders to go further. In strike after strike, leaders have wanted to settle, and the workers have pushed to continue further. Look at the RCN, which began as the most naive, with no experience of strike action. And yet, when your leadership are telling you you've got to accept this deal, to vote it down and fight for more action, that takes real courage. Because you can't rely on your leadership to then organise the strike action, but the RCN did it, which is incredible. And Pat Cullen has been forced to reballot and to go for further strike action. This may be me being a little bit too cynical, but I do suspect that the reason she's gone for an aggregated ballot rather than a disaggregated ballot like the previous ones is because that means that unless they get over the thresholds nationally everywhere, they won't be able to take further strike action. So it could be left with Unite Fighting alone in the RCN, or she could be wrong, and they could get that vote despite a certain lack of leadership, let's be polite, from the top. But the most important thing for us is there is a whole generation of nurses who have been hardened in that battle and have fought back consistently. The same, look at the CWU. There was a lot of anger at the CWU deal. It has won some concessions. It's not the crushing of the unions that could have taken place in that battle in Royal Mail. But nonetheless, as you all know, it's a bad deal. It means in real terms 3-year pay cut, a reduction in sick pay, a whole number of other bad things, and of course, it promises nothing in substance for the 400 sacked and suspended reps that are fighting for reinstatement. So it's been absolutely correct that we've called for a no vote. I would say, though, it's also correct that we've done that in a balanced and reasoned way and not in the kind of shrill denunciatory way of some of the other left groups. Because there are good postie reps who are thinking this is just the most we can win. We know it's not very good, but we've got to go for it. And we have to engage and discuss that. The last mass meeting down in London, us and the Socialist Workers' Party and some other left groups were giving out their leaflets, and there were reps shouting at them, not all the reps. It's disgusting what you're saying about us. But then they saw Rob Williams giving out our leaflet and said, not you, Rob. It was also arguing for rejection, but it was doing it in a sensible, reasonable, balanced way. That's correct, but the scale of the anger is shown by the fact, of course, it's not gone out to ballot. They've had to halt sending it out to ballot because management are on the offensive, workers are taking strike action against that, and they've had to pull back from sending that out to ballot. And there's a whole number of other strikes in which we can see the membership have pushed from below, and that has meant that strikes have not ended even when the leaders thought they had the end in sight because members have felt they could win more. That's all, if you like, the first wave of struggle. But there's still more coming. There's still the NEU reballoting at the moment. Unison, local government now are balloting for action over a virtually identical deal to the deal which they argued for support for last year. And that is a reflection of the greater anger and pressure that is coming from them below, and the effect of the strikes on the working class as a whole. Because not every strike that has been settled has been what we would call a good deal. A number we feel a lot more could have been won, but there is not a single strike where the workers are worse off as a result of having gone on strike. The general feeling is striking works. We've given it a go and we've won something, and that, as conclusion, has been drawn by wider sections of the working class. That mood is not going anywhere, and that means why we've got to be prepared for continued eruptions of struggle in the period that we're going into. And into that febrile atmosphere, this stupid government has thrown the new anti-trade union laws, the minimum service legislation. The last lot they put through in 2016, there were no strikes going on. It's very different trying to implement this now. The attitude of the capitalist class to this legislation is actually shown by what the Lords did to it. Because the Lords gutted it, there was nothing left. It would have, there would have had no consequence if it had stayed like that. Of course, the Commons have added it all back in again, and it might now ping-pong between the two for a while, but it's also possible that that legislation will get royal assent before the National Shop Stewards Network conference at the end of this month. So the issue now is not stopping it getting on the statute books. That could have happened. The working class in Britain could have done what was done in Canada, where they threatened general strike action and the legislation was withdrawn, but that isn't going to happen now. It's going, in all likelihood, to go onto the statute books. So the discussion then is on how we prevent it having any effect on workers' ability to strike. And the first thing to say, I've not got time to go into it in detail, but this is extremely loosely, uselessly worded legislation, which actually doesn't leave it for the government to do anything. It's all on the employer. The employer may issue a work notice if they'd like to. They don't have to. The employer may take the workers to court if they break that work notice, but they don't have to. So it's all on the employers. The government is not actually directly involved at all. So, of course, the first question is the unions demanding that employers say they're not going to do it. The SNP told the Scottish TUC that the Scottish government will not do it. Well, what about every Labour council, Labour mayor up and down the country? Why aren't they saying that they won't do it? They are under no obligation whatsoever. And yet at the moment, for example, the Welsh Labour government are saying, we'll try and find a way around it. You don't have to try and find a way around it. You just say you are not going to do it. So that's the first question, demanding that. But of course, beyond that is defiance. Mick Lynch was absolutely right from the RMT when he said, we will not accept the work notices or cooperate with them. But that has to be combined with saying, if unions are fined, and that's what will happen, individual workers can be sacked and unions can be fined. If that happens, then the whole of the workers' movement will mobilise, including starting with a mass demonstration outside the courts when whatever union is in court, but then building to a 24-hour general strike against any attempts to do so. There's bound to be an element of evasion of the law, and there's quite a lot of room for that, of the people who've had work notices being sick and so on. You know, you can imagine all the ways there are for getting round it. But I think beyond that, given the atmosphere and the weakness of this government, there is a real possibility, if the legislation is used by an employer in a big way, it could lead to an uprising from below. It's ancient history, even before my time. But if you go back to 1972, 5 dockers were jailed, I was alive, but only just, under anti-trade union legislation at that point in time, and a general strike began to develop from below, which resulted in them being released, but in reality, in that legislation being finished as an effective tool against the working class. And you could see that kind of development, particularly because if you read what's going to be in Labour's manifesto, according to the Labour Policy Forum, it is shocking even to a Marxist how incredibly right-wing it is. But the one thing that's still in it is they say they will repeal this and the 2016 anti-union legislation. Now, how much they actually do, given the strikes they're going to be facing, let's see. Blair never repealed any anti-union legislation. But they're throwing the unions that bone in order to try and mobilise the workers' movement to vote for them. But that means this feels completely like temporary legislation that's got to be gone as soon as Labour are in office. And of course, we should demand not just that they don't carry it out where they're in power locally, but they say not only will we repeal it, but any union that is fined, we will reverse that and get them the money back the minute that we come to office, which would finish the legislation if they were prepared to say that. So, to finish on the industrial issues, because I know I need to go on briefly to the political, it's true that we're no longer in the kind of first ecstatic wave of strike action, which was a period when most people who were out had never been on strike before, were really excited about it, but hadn't yet thought through how they were going to win, you know, so it was great to be part of. But actually, where we are now, people have started to think a bit more. And that leaves big potential for us. We've got the National Shop Stewards Network Conference coming up at the end of June. Every year, we mobilise workers who are on strike to come to that conference. This year, we have to be aiming to mobilise every worker we've talked to on a picket line. We won't get them all there, but we should get as many as we can, because there is a new generation coming into the trade unions. In the NEU, for example, their membership has increased by 1/4, but more importantly, they've got 3,500 new reps. That's a lot of reps that we should be approaching and saying, if you want to prepare to defeat the minimum service bill, if you want to prepare to make sure we win next time, and you want to meet militant reps from the other unions that have been involved in strike action, come to this conference and we can make a real step forward at that NSSN conference at the end of June. So not now, but when I finish my lead up, I'm going to pass around this sheet about who's coming and who you're bringing in order to help this conference build for that. That's an important part of what we've got to discuss today, how we can win the best of this new militant layer to our party. But I think the other theme of today's meeting is inevitably going to be the questions around our fight for a new mass workers' party and where that is at this particular stage. I think the first thing I'd say is, for newer members, why do we raise it? After all, we want everyone to join the Socialist Party. So why do we bother to talk about a new mass workers' party? For us, it's what we call a transitional demand. It's part of our programme. And our programme aims, with those workers we can reach, to take them from the immediate issues they're thinking about now, whether that's their pay or whatever the different current issues, to the fact that the way to permanently solve those issues is for the working class to take power. So it's a bridge between those two things. And clearly, the working class having its own party, the trade unions not being just industrial fighters but also having a political voice, that is a really important transitional demand. Because it's part of the working class having the idea we should be the government. We shouldn't just be voting for different bosses, politicians. We should be the ones in power. Of course, we will always campaign for any new party that comes into existence to adopt our programme, a revolutionary programme. That's what we want, for any party to adopt the programme of the Socialist Party. And by the way, there can be circumstances, particularly where parties come into existence very quickly as part of mass revolutionary uprisings, particularly in the neo-colonial world, where from the beginning you can go from having no party to a mass party that has a revolutionary programme. But in most cases, it's more likely that a new party we get, certainly in Britain, will not draw all the conclusions we've drawn in the first instance. It's more likely, for example, on nationalisation, to support nationalisation of rail, mail, energy, a Corbyn-type programme, rather than nationalisation of all the major corporations and banks in the way that we put it forward. We can't answer that in advance. But we have to fight for the idea that the working class should have its own party and fight for the idea for it to adopt a socialist programme. And even if it's got quite a limited programme, it will be an important step forward. Because then workers are together in a party discussing how do we achieve this? How are we going to get it? It's true, a new party actually might be quite unstable. Because if it does have a leadership that puts forward a very limited programme initially, that's not going to cut the mustard. We know how much Corbyn was attacked in opposition. Imagine how much a Corbyn government would have been attacked. And therefore the question is posed of leading the working class to overthrow capitalism or capitulating, sometimes quite quickly. And you can have parties like Syriza in Greece, which was elected as a new left radical party and has just got absolutely smashed in the elections that have taken place because it capitulated and did the bidding of big business. So we could be fighting for a new party that then goes into crisis quite quickly. But of course, even if that's what happens, we'll be there with our programme, arguing for our way forward, and potentially out of splits in such a party, you could have the possibility of developing a mass revolutionary party with the programme of the Socialist Party. And in our view, it's very important now that we fight on this issue of the need for the working class to have its own party. The working class has entered the scene of history industrially, in terms of strikes, and is therefore inevitably at least beginning to think, don't we need a political voice too? Not everybody, but sections of the working class are thinking that. And at the same time, Starmer is doing our job for us. I mean, Jesus Christ. How much more right-wing can you get? All the speeches about how he's proud to be conservative, he's Tony Blair on steroids, private sector in the NHS, ditching free education. I mean, I could go on, you all know it, but it makes it pretty obvious to a lot of people that this party is not standing up in the interests of the working class. And therefore, the idea that we raise, that we need our own party, and at least as a first step, we should have a workers' list of candidates in this general election, that can get quite wide support if we fight on it. Now, I just want to balance that, because I think especially people who weren't around when Labour got elected before, we have to warn as well that there will also be amongst some people this mood of, we've got to get rid of the Tories, so just vote Labour, and could you shut up? Because we don't want to think about how bad Starmer is, we've got to go and vote for him, so stop going on, and you'll get that mood as well. And actually, in the immediate period after Labour has won an election, that can get stronger, because people feel, oh, it's got to be better. It'll be shallow, it won't last that long, but actually the one thing that might temporarily cut across the strike wave is that the union leaders will use that to say, this is our government, you've got to give them a chance, and for a certain period of time could succeed in cutting across the strikes. However, crisis will engulf a Starmer-led government all too quickly. No capitalist government is stable these days. The SNP seem to be the exception, but that's gone. And this will be a government coming to power against the background of economic crisis, with people having, because of Corbynism, an idea that something better was possible, that we might have had a government that nationalised some things, that did something for working class people, and at a time where the working class is beginning to fight back. But in our view, it would be a mistake to think, let's just wait for Labour to get in and then start fighting for a new mass party. We've got to be doing the preparatory work now. And at the union conferences this year, it's already clear this will be an issue for debate. I think some of our comments have felt like, well, should we raise it? Are we going to be marginalised? We had discussions in the PCS and the comments moved to very good emergency resolution. But we didn't put it in the paper because they weren't trying to get it through anywhere, which is fair enough. We shouldn't count our chickens before they hatch. But Dave Semple, a comrade in the PCS, got it past 52-0 through his branch, which is an indication that there is real support for the idea we should be standing workers' candidates in the elections. We should be backing Corbyn standing as an independent. Of course, the leadership of the PCS still kept it off the agenda, so it wasn't discussed at the conference. And there will be similar debates and battles at the RMT, the Unite, maybe other union conferences, and we don't know the outcome of those battles. It is not the most likely that the union leaders will be pushed into founding a new party before the general election. I think we can say that. It's possible they will be pushed far enough that there will be official union funding for a workers' list, maybe with them actually standing under the auspices of Tusk. Maybe we won't even achieve that, but we have to engage and see. And out of that battle, we will get workers around us who want to make sure that there is a workers' challenge at the general election. Of course, one factor that will have a certain effect on this process is the Jeremy Corbyn factor. I know, in a sense, he's history now, because he doesn't say a lot, he's not in the national media much, and he hasn't yet declared he's standing in the general election. I did a stall on my local high street where we were raising the idea of backing Jeremy Corbyn standing as an independent, and I honestly had two people say to me, I'm not signing that. One of them said, I'm not signing it because he's got to man up. I was like, well, I wouldn't exactly put it like that, but I know where you're coming from. And the other said the same thing in different words. They supported him, but the fact he hasn't declared meant they weren't prepared to engage at this point. But that also shows that if he declares, and in our view it's most likely that he will, he's trying to go through the whole Labour Party process, even though it's obvious to the entire universe he's not going to be allowed to stand for Labour, but he's probably waiting for his constituency to be shut down before he declares, but at that point, he probably will. And that will, even if he wants to do it as an independent with no broader consequences, that will pose for broader sections of the working class. Don't we need more than this? We should be backing Jeremy, but shouldn't we also be having other candidates? So we have to engage on this issue of fighting for a new mass workers' party. And of course, the work we do as part of the trade unionist and socialist coalition is an important lever in that fight for a new mass workers' party. Look, it's modest what we do as Tusk. You all know, we did fantastically in Sheffield. We got 2,800 votes, I think, which is brilliant. But overall, our average was only 3.2% of the vote nationally. We stood in just over 250 seats. It's small, but it's far bigger than what anybody else on the left is doing. The next along was the Communist Party of Britain, who stood in 15 seats and got a virtually identical percentage of the vote. So what Tusk is doing is bigger than other forces, and it's acting, the combination of the complete vacuum, the fact no one else is doing anything effective, and Starmer is so bad, means it's acting as a pole of attraction, without exaggerating. But we got more people applying to join Tusk in this local elections than we've done, I think, in the history of standing in local elections. 20% of the candidates were not members of the Socialist Party. We've had, for example, a councillor who's been elected in North Yorkshire who's approached to become part of the Tusk steering committee as a kind of ex-Labour, Ben supporting group and so on. In Leicester, the people who've been kicked out of Labour actually stood against Tusk for the mayor, got a bigger vote than us, but are now taking part in Tusk to discuss a challenge for the general election. It's acting as a certain pole of attraction, so we have to keep developing that, preparing for next year's locals and the general election. But the final points I want to make, and this is a bit transgressing into organisation and the things that you'll discuss this afternoon, is a vital part of being a revolutionary is to be able to put forward what next for the working class. There is no use in spouting about revolution, quoting Trotsky, if you've got nothing to say about what should be done now. So our programme, the strategy we put forward in the different strikes, our programme for how to defy the minimum service bill, the work we do in Tusk, that is all vital. But at the same time, it's not all we do. We're fighting for a new world. We have to link those immediate issues to the question of socialism and recognise that most people join us because they want to see a different world, because they were appalled by climate change, by war, by horror, and they're looking for socialist ideas. And therefore, in everything we do, building our party, building the Socialist Party, has to be the central thread that is running through it. Keeping our party profile high, asking people to join us. We're a small force. We've got 1,965 members as of today. But that means by the end of our recruitment quarter, which is coming up at the end of this month, we can get past 2,000. And that really does mean that by the end of this year, we could be well over 2,000. We could be heading towards 2,500, because we've entered a period where there is a generation who are starting to look for socialist ideas, who get more left-wing when they get older, not more right-wing, because capitalism's so bad, which is a change from what used to happen traditionally. And at the same time, and this is a big change for us, are now starting to see that the working class is the force that can fight for change. Because there were lots of young people who thought they were socialists 3 years ago, but they had no idea of the role of the working class in fighting for change. But the strikes have begun to change that and give us greater opportunities. The working class is reawakening, is learning fast, and that means there are huge opportunities for the Socialist Party which we have to grasp.